This podcast is brought to you by Free Buddhist Audio, the Dharma for your life. Our work is funded entirely by donations from our generous listeners. If you would like to help us keep this free, make a contribution at freebuddhistaudio.com/donate. Thank you, and happy listening.
Thank you. I do want to talk a little bit, the theme, obviously, of the day is the awakening mind. So I'll try at least and kind of engage with that a bit. First 2 months of this year, along with Maitreyi, we were on a retreat in Wales for all of January and February. So there were kind of 30 of us in an off-season hotel on the coast of the Gower Peninsula. And very interesting retreat, just lovely having 30 order members practicing together, just really sort of simply, really simple, on a way quite a simple programme. But on that retreat, every day, 6 times a day, Vasantra, who was leading the retreat, did a little lead-in. And because I was doing that lead-in 6 times a day, 7 days a week for 8 weeks or whatever it was, it really seems to have gone in, and it seems to be the framework out of which I'm looking at a lot of kind of formulations of the Dharma. So I wanted to start off, if I may, with that simple lead-in to a meditation. I think it touches on some quite fundamental aspects of Dharma practice. So if you don't mind, I'd like to spend just 5 or 10 minutes doing a little lead through, a kind of preparation for meditation, and then I'll talk a bit. Okay, so almost the most basic Buddhist practice, just become aware of our breath. Just letting the breath connect us to our experience right now. Not trying to shut out any noises outside, just acknowledge them, let them go. So first of all, just take a moment just to make it conscious what we're doing right now. So for the next 5 minutes, maybe 10 minutes, we're just going to be paying a little closer attention to our experience. Just sort of connecting with that intention, just reminding ourselves that we're doing that. And then following the breath down through the body and down to our point of contact with the cushion, with the ground, with the chair that we're on. So we're celebrating the Buddha's enlightenment. Buddha was enlightened under a tree. And just having that sense of roots, that sense of connection with the earth. Traditionally, the earth element in the Buddhist tradition has this quality of stability. This sense of reliable support that we can just let ourselves rest on, be supported by. So looking for that sense of rootedness, groundedness, support. Breathing down into the earth. Just picking up that image of a tree, just having a sense of our body rising up from that support, rising up from that rootedness. Like the branches of a tree opening out into openness, into spaciousness. And if we can, just having a sense of those two qualities in our experience at the same time, that groundedness, that openness. Letting that openness include all the sensations of the body, just becoming sensitive to how our body feels, breathing into it. Aware of the point of contact with our nose and our mouth. A sense of breathing in to our heart center. Breathing into our belly. Breathing into that connection with the earth. And just bringing our awareness back to our heart center. Just having a sense of being aware from our heart center. And particularly looking for a quality of awareness that has a kind of clarity in it, but also a kindness in it. Kind awareness of our body, kind awareness of all the sensations arising in our body. And from that heart center, from that quality of awareness and kindness, just bringing attention back to the breath. Just having a sense that with every in-breath, sense of our body our awareness being revitalized, energized, woken up. And a sense that with every out-breath, just looking for a sense of relaxing and letting go. With every in-breath, just a sense of opening up, allowing in the life around us. With every out-breath, just looking for a sense of connecting with that life, responding to that life. Every in-breath, we're letting go of that habit of pushing away, letting go of aversion. Every out-breath, we're letting go of the habit of holding on, just softening that habit of craving, clinging. And finally, maybe just for a moment, just reflecting on what we've just done and what, if anything, in that practice kind of spoke to us, anything that seemed meaningful, anything that felt good. And finally, just before we finish, keeping that connection to ourselves, just having a sense of the people around us, breathing with us. And then bringing our awareness back into the room. So the programme for the whole day has been looking at this topic of the awakening mind. Now, I don't want to overstate it, but I think even in that little exercise you get a couple of clues about what this language of the awakening mind is trying to point us to. That the awakening mind obviously points to, in a sense, the root experience for the whole Buddhist tradition. So around 2,500 years ago, on the May full moon, the Buddha was enlightened, according to the tradition. And a couple of months later, after he'd assimilated what happened, made the effort. He walked a couple of 100 miles from Bodh Gaya to Varanasi, to Sarnath, and met the people that he used to practice with and tried to explain to them what his experience was like. So trying to find the language that gave them a sense of what this experience of awakening was like. And you get this sort of second moment that's really significant in the Buddhist tradition of one of the 5 people that he was talking to getting it. And there's this famous line in the Pali Canon that just says, Kandanya knows. And you could really feel it mattered that, that he had just walked a couple of 100 miles to try and explain this. So somebody else getting what it was that he was talking about was obviously something of real importance and significance for the Buddha himself. So you've got those couple of moments of this experience of awakening, and then this equally important moment where it turns out that that experience of awakening can be communicated and can be transmitted. And in a sense, the whole Buddhist tradition comes from that moment of communicating the experience of awakening. So in a sense, the awakening mind is talking about that moment, those moments. But the awakening mind, it's also one of the, I was going to say traditional, but one of the terms that's been used in English to translate the traditional term bodhicitta. So bodhi literally means awakening, chitta literally translates as mind or translates as heart. So talking about bodhicitta as the awakening mind, the awakening heart, is as good a translation as any. There's other ways of talking about it. There's a volitional aspect to the bodhicitta, and Sangharakshita often talks about it as the will to enlightenment or the will to awakening. But the awakening mind is also talking about bodhicitta. And one of the points that the tradition is making is that this capacity for awakening is intrinsic to the human mind. It's intrinsic to the nature of things. And that, like everything else in the Buddhist tradition, bodhicitta, this arising of the awakening mind, comes into being independence on certain conditions. And what the tradition says about any practice is if you put the conditions in place, the outcome follows as part of the nature of things. It's not random. You pay attention to your breath, and broadly speaking, it connects you more deeply to your experience. You become more connected to your experience, and broadly speaking, your experience becomes richer, and some of the habitual habits, the habitual tensions, just spontaneously start to release themselves, just part of the nature of things. And likewise with the bodhicitta, we put the conditions in place, and this unfolding of awakening, this volition towards awakening, happens as part of the nature of things. So the tradition has gone to trouble, not trouble, I'm sure some people took definite pleasure in it, but the tradition has tried to articulate what the conditions are that support the unfolding of the awakening mind. So I want to talk about one of the traditional sets of conditions that support that process of the awakening mind. In the Indian tradition, in the Indo-Tibetan tradition, there are two main descriptions of those conditions. One of them goes back, I believe there have been readings through the day today from the Bodhicharya Avatara. So one of the classical descriptions of the conditions that support the arising of the bodhicitta, the unfolding of the awakening mind, come from this text, the Bodhicharya Avatara by Shantideva. And there's a whole tradition that grows from Shantideva's description of the conditions that support bodhicitta. There's a second tradition, and the second tradition is probably a little less well known, but it's a tradition that goes back to a 4th century Indian teacher called Vasubandhu. And Vasubandhu described 4 conditions that together support the arising of the bodhicitta. I'm going to mention the name of the text, basically just to show off. Right, the text is called the Bodhicitta Otpada Sutra Shastra, which of course means the treatise on the sutras that deal with the arising of the bodhicitta. So it's Vasubandhu trying to boil down the texts that deal with the arising of the bodhicitta and to describe the key conditions. And I want to try and link those conditions to that little reflection that we just did. I think it's more than just habit of 2 months on retreat that makes me kind of see the link. I think there is a bit of a connection, so I want to try and explore that a little bit. But the text says that the really distinctive bit of Vasubandhu's text says that there are 4 conditions through which one gives rise to bodhicitta. And then the nice rhetorical question in the text, what are these 4? Mm-hmm. So it goes on to answer his own question. And he says, the first is that one gives rise to bodhicitta by reflecting on the Buddhas. The second is that one gives rise to bodhicitta by reflecting on the faults of material existence. The third one is that one gives rise to bodhicitta while feeling pity or compassion for beings. And the fourth one is that one gives rise to bodhicitta by aspiring to the qualities of the Buddhas. So those are the 4 conditions, reflecting on the Buddhas, reflecting on the faults of material existence, reflecting on the suffering of beings, and reflecting on the qualities of the Buddhas. So I want to try and say something about each of those. Traditionally, Shantideva's approach to bodhicitta is seen as the more devotional approach. And if you know the Sevenfold Puja, even if you're not familiar with the Bodhicharya Avatara, the Sevenfold Puja is actually extracts from the Bodhicharya Avatara. Vasubandhu's text is seen as a bit more reflective and maybe in some ways a bit more philosophical. So that this is looking at that more reflective approach to bodhicitta. So the first of those, that one gives rise to bodhicitta while reflecting on the Buddhas. And I wanted to link that just to that very kind of simple part of the reflection where we're trying to be a bit clear about what we're doing. You know, just to, I don't know about you, but a lot of the time what goes on in my mind is kind of random. And just, I can easily carry that into a meditation session that can carry on pretty much as random as I habitually am. So just a really simple shift in gear is that when you start to meditate, just connecting with the intention that you're going to be attending to your experience and just starting to get that intention a little bit more of a shaping current in our experience. So first step I'd like to suggest is that this reflecting on the Buddhas is a connection to that emerging stream in our experience that's trying to move towards deeper awareness. Sangharakshita says somewhere that spiritual growth is essentially growth in consciousness, and that growth in consciousness needs to be consciously directed. So you're just starting to bring a kind of conscious intention to open up more clearly to experience. That's the first connection I wanted to make. But Vasubandhu goes on and he says, one reflects, I shall give rise to bodhicitta on the basis that just as all the Buddhas at the beginning of giving rise to bodhicitta were not free from defilements, and one reflects that each of the Buddhas made effort in order to gain awakening, if awakening is a thing that can be obtained, I can obtain it. So something that the Buddhist tradition says is that capacity for awakening it's literally a potential within our experience. As soon as you stop for a moment, as soon as you look for this quality of awareness and kindness, as soon as you start to notice what's going on in your experience, as soon as we move out of the habit of not really responding to what's emerging, and we start to be a bit more responsive, a bit more connected, that process of awakening, in a sense, is as close as that. For most of us, in that little reflection, some of the key elements of what bodhicitta is like, that emerging awareness, that emerging sense of connection, it's as close as, it's basically how our minds work. And what we're doing is we're starting to notice those qualities in our own minds, and by attending to them, we give them space to unfold. So the first thing that we're doing in this giving rise to bodhicitta while reflecting on the Buddhas, it's starting to get a real sense that possibility of unfolding experience is kind of easily available to us. I was going to get a little bit biographical here. I'm afraid, sort of sidetrack myself. But I was remembering when I first came along to a Buddhist centre, I'd be hard pressed to tell you what it was that I was looking for. A lot of talks that I've given recently, I find myself quoting an American psychologist called James Hillman. And Hillman talks about purpose in our lives. And he says that purpose doesn't usually appear as a clearly framed goal. It usually appears as a troubling, unclear urge, coupled with a sense of indubitable importance. So I don't know what it was that brought you along to a Buddhist centre, right? But I'm guessing that for some of you, this sense of a troubling, unclear urge, along with an indubitable sense of importance, might fit in there somewhere. That totally would describe what brought me along to the Buddhist centre. And one of my experiences of coming in contact with the Dharma was, I've said this in other talks, if you've heard me say this before, excuse me for repeating myself, but the first Buddhist class that I came to, I couldn't concentrate in the meditation, I couldn't understand the talk, and I hated the puja. And I thought, this is it, this is what I've been looking for. And just something that this troubling, unclear urge had a kind of shape, or at least a shape that I sort of recognised or resonated with. And I had been doing the rounds, I'd been going to every spiritual group from the Baptists and the Free Church of Scotland onwards through my teens, been going to political groups, I got involved in trade unions, I'd been going to anarchist groups. And I remember the first time hearing the traditional description of bodhicitta. And the traditional description of bodhicitta is awakening in a way that's of greatest benefit to all beings. And I thought, that's what I care about. That's the thing that I most deeply care about. And it's so simple, and I couldn't have articulated before coming across that. So that particular framing might or might not resonate with you, but that there's something about coming into contact with a framework and with a teaching that connects us more clearly and more deeply to our own experience, that our hearts resonate with. There's a recognition that even if I couldn't have articulated it, this is what I've been looking for. If you don't mind, I'm going to squeeze in a little poem. St Francis Nassau by Galway Kinneal, I think his name is. So the poem says, at least the first half of it, the bud stands for all things. even for those things that don't flower, because everything flowers from within of self-blessing. Though sometimes it's necessary to reteach a thing its own loveliness, to put a hand on the brow of the flower, and to retell it in words and in touch that it's lovely, until it flowers again from within of self-blessing. And I think one of the things that the Dharma's doing is it's teaching you again that we're lovely and that there's something in us that wants to flower, and describes the conditions that allow that flowering, that support that flowering. So, first one, if I may say so, the giving rise to the bodhicitta while reflecting on the Buddhas, the key element of that is that awakening in our own experience is possible, and that the Buddha was as defiled and confused as we were. If you read the Buddha's biography, like basically he's a troubled 20-year-old arguing with his parents about what he's going to do with his life, and then the whole kind of quest comes out of that. As defiled as we are, he went through a process of awakening, and the whole teaching is that it's available to us if it resonates with us and if we choose to engage with it. So that's the first of Vasubandhu's conditions. The second one is that we give rise to the awakening mind by reflecting on the faults of material existence. I think this can sound more pessimistic than it is. And I want to link this to that experience of groundedness, that experience of rootedness. So what the Buddhist tradition is saying is that habitually we're very caught up with outside experience. We've got some very deep habits, and that pleasant experience tends to create a habit of clinging, a habit of holding on to the pleasurable. That painful experience tends to create a habit of resistance and a habit of pushing away the painful. And what's being said in the tradition, that as long as those habits are driving our experience, our minds are all over the place, what is called the 8 worldly winds. So we're just being blown this way and that. And what the Buddhist tradition is saying, what this thing about the faults of material existence is saying, is that no outside reference is ever going to create a still, grounded, deep experience. And that what we have to do is to take our attention from trying to manipulate the experience around us. It's not that you can't interact with the experience around you, but you're not making your own stability dependent on things that you can't control. So almost the first step in practice is that you're taking awareness and attention away from outside circumstances, and you're starting to look at the quality of your response to those circumstances. And what's being said is that it's possible to create a centeredness and a groundedness, and even that it's not that hard. Just connect with the breath, let the breath connect you with the body, let that grounded awareness connect you with how you feel. And the crucial step is that rather than being caught in how we feel, rather than being caught in what we're attending to, there's this idea that everything is responded to out of awareness and kindness. So pleasurable experience that arises, you're fully available to it, but you're not caught in it. Painful experience that arises, you're responding to with love rather than resistance. So more and more, there's this quality of groundedness, centeredness, and out of that grounded, centered connection with ourselves, there's a consistent quality to our response to what goes on round about us. There's a flavour to it that the Karaniya Metta Sutta talks about a mother in relationship to her children. So in a way you're watching the mind do its thing, but you're coming at it from a kind of position of maturity and love in relationship to everything that's arising. So that brings us on. That's giving rise to bodhicitta by reflecting on the faults of material existence. So it's not a nihilistic position. It's not that you're suddenly in this sort of denial of your outside experience. It's just realising it's never going to be the basis for stability, and that the basis for stability comes in a sense from a withdrawal, but it's a withdrawal so we're attending to the quality of our response, the quality of our awareness. So the third of Vasubandhu's 4 conditions is that one gives rise to bodhicitta while feeling compassion for beings. And I think where I'd like to connect that to the reflection that we did is it's out of that sense of groundedness, of rootedness, that the openness becomes possible. Like a lot of the time it's, we're trying to kind of get stable, get protected, and a lot of the time we kind of limit, close off from experience. But if we're coming from that sense of connection to ourselves and coming from that sense of groundedness in ourselves, then openness becomes possible. The beautiful image of what makes the branches of a tree able to open to the sky is the solidity of the trunk and the depth of the roots. So out of that stability comes an increasing capacity for openness and for responsiveness. So that this morning in the day we were going through the Brahma Viharas, and the Brahma Viharas are a great description of this quality of openness. So the first of the Brahma Viharas is just basically metta, and it's this standing, stable responsiveness to whatever arises. Getting back to my 2-month retreat, one of the little lead-ins that I loved, I really found helpful in meditation, was this instruction that everything that arises in awareness is known and it's cared for. So if you want a bit of a summary of what wisdom and compassion looks like in practice, everything that arises in experience, from an itch on your nose to a memory of grieving, is known and it's cared for. So metta is this starting relationship to experience where anything that arises is known and it's cared for. That's what practice is about. Then specifically, second to the Brahma Viharas, mudita is sympathetic joy. And what's being said is that responsiveness, coming into relationship to an experience in ourselves, an experience in somebody else that has this flavour of opening or this flavour of awakening to it. We just appreciate it. There's a pleasure in seeing this process of people becoming more alive, ourselves becoming more alive. So mudita is just that responsiveness that appreciates emerging life. Karuna is that same openness coming into relationship to our own or to somebody else's pain. Karuna gets translated as compassion. And sometimes you get this little phrase, this almost puzzling little phrase in the Buddhist tradition, that compassion is a painless sympathy with pain. And what makes it a painless sympathy with pain is that the openness is there. We can really feel our own, we can really feel other people's pain. But that's not what shapes our experience. The pain's not shaping our experience. What's shaping our experience is the love. So at the centre of that quality of responsiveness is an experience of love. And because the love is the shaping experience, there's both the compassion there, the responsiveness there, but you're not caught in the distress. So this flavour of an availability to your own, to other people's painful experience, that's a painless sympathy with pain, without it being in the slightest bit indifferent. So that's what's being got at here in this third condition for the arising of bodhicitta. And it's interesting though that they single out compassion. This again maybe goes right back to the core of the Buddhist tradition. Sangharakshita says somewhere we grow for the reason that any change happens, and that is a move away from suffering towards liberation from suffering. So it's particularly our awareness of our own and other people's pain that can become a strong motivation for that process of growth. In particular, in the Bodhisattva tradition, the Bodhicitta tradition, it's all of spiritual growth is a move away from our habit of self-identification and self-clinging. So the whole process of spiritual practice is a process of waking up and opening up to the life around us. And you come into contact with somebody else's pain, and the spontaneous wish is to help, to respond to it in a way that's going to help to alleviate that pain. There's a practice that we do in Sri Lanka called the Bodhicitta practice. And there's a little reflection in the Bodhicitta practice that goes, all beings like ourselves want to be happy. All beings like ourselves do the things that cause ourselves suffering. And there's this lovely little line in it that says, what a pity. And out of that, what a pity, the text goes on, so we generate an unbearable longing for liberation. So out of that sensitivity to our own, to other people's pain, at least come the seeds of an unbearable longing for liberation. So then the fourth of the Brahmaviharas is Upekkha. And Upekkha gets translated as equanimity. And at the risk of quoting a source that I don't have a lot of confidence in, the word that just came to mind, Upekkha's not levelling down, it's levelling up. Right, but for those of you who are political in the room, but it's this idea again that this stability of responsiveness, the equanimity isn't that you don't care about anything, it's that everything is responded to out of awareness and out of kindness. That's what Upekkha looks like. That's what makes it equanimity. It's a stability of responsiveness to whatever arises. So the fourth of Vasubandhu's conditions is that one gives rise to bodhicitta by recalling the qualities of the Buddhas at their highest level. So what does that mean? Going back to my 2-month retreat again, a helpful little hint in practice is the idea of taking the goal as the path. Right, so this comes especially, I think, from the Vajrayana tradition. But what's being said in this idea of taking the goal as the path is that, quite often when we think about practice, we're thinking that we're scatty and we've got to develop awareness, we're indifferent and we've got to develop metta or compassion. But this idea of taking the goal as the path, it's not an alternative to that, but it's a balance to that. And it's this quality again of becoming receptive to those qualities that are already there in our experience. One of the things that Sangharakshita says in the seminar on this text, he's quoting, I think he does, anyway, there's a quote about Avalokiteshvara, who's the Bodhisattva of compassion. And Avalokiteshvara, it's this cosmic idea of what compassion is. But there's a little verse that goes, wherever there's an act of kindness, Avalokiteshvara is there. And it's a bit like that with the qualities of awakening. You start to, in that little reflection that we did, when you start to notice your own capacity for awareness and kindness, it's not that you've got to laboriously make the kindness come into being or laboriously bring the awareness into being. In a sense, they're always there as capacities. The fact that you're, however intermittently, kind of following the talk, the fact that we can kind of respond to it emotionally, you're already looking at some of the basic building blocks of what awakening looks like. And by tuning into those, by becoming receptive to those, you allow those, again, it's back to this idea almost that bodhicitta is an intrinsic capacity of our own minds. It's part of the nature of the mind. And you're starting to become alive to, receptive to those qualities that are there already. And by attending to them, again, we make them more real. We allow them the space to become more and more the shaping current in our being. One of the things that traditionally, one of the practices for this, so it says here we recollect the qualities of the Buddha, and one of the traditional practices in the Buddhist tradition is what's called Buddhanusati or Buddhanusmriti. And it's a recollection of the qualities of the Buddha. But one of the things that's being said there is, at its heart, right at the core of the Buddhist tradition, is a living, lived human experience. And Buddhism's fantastically philosophically precise, but you can mistake Buddhism's conceptual clarity for the, as it were, the gist of the Dharma. But all those expressions of the Dharma, all of those lists, all of those practices are trying to point back to living capacities in our own awareness. And it's the Buddha, from his living experience, trying to communicate to us what that lived experience of awakening is like. So behind the concepts, we're pointing to a living experience. And it might work for you, this traditional practice of recollecting the Buddha. For some of us, it's going to be meditation practice, it's going to be Dharma study. But really what it is a direct, intuitive sense of those qualities in your own experience that lead in the direction of awakening. And more it's starting to align ourselves with those qualities. And that brings me on to the last bit of Vasubandhu's text, that the four conditions are followed by the vow. And the vow is just starting to make conscious again. You have those moments where we wake up to what's possible in our own experience. Like from what we're talking about in the language of awakening. And from a kind of cognitive point of view, awakening works. It's the language of wisdom, it's the language of clear seeing. We're talking about awakening from an emotional point of view in terms of the language of bliss. Enlightenment is talked about as the deepest bliss. Talking about it in the language of love, it's talked about in terms of compassion. From a volitional point of view, it's talked about in terms of liberation. And what's being said is that quite often what's driving the shape that our lives take, whether it's the jobs that we take, the relationships that we're in, quite often there's something qualitative that's the driver underneath those specific shapes. And the Buddhist tradition is that there's a bud there that's wanting to flower, that there's a drive to move towards clarity rather than confusion, towards connection rather than separation, and towards freedom rather than frustration and constraint. And whatever language we use, however we describe it to ourselves, it's that moment of recognition of what's possible in that experience, that wee moment of connection to ourselves, a bit more awareness and kindness in relationship to the people around us, and this decision to move our own volition behind that unfolding process. That's what the vow is about. And the vow can seem quite grand. Vasubandhu talks about it again in terms of this language of generating this impulse towards liberation for all beings. But Sangharakshita in the seminar says basically you can chunk it down from that. Sometimes you're kind, sometimes you're helpful, sometimes you're able to concentrate. And those germs, those seeds are there. If you notice them, if you support them, they become more and more the central current in our own experience. And this very beautiful, very grand idea of the awakening mind, you can start to see as an unfolding moment-to-moment process in our own experience. And as the text says, available here and now, it's as close as that. You take awareness there. And then Shantideva, just like a blind man discovering a jewel in a heap of rubbish, somehow an awakening mind has been born within me.
We hope you enjoyed this week's podcast. Please help us keep this free. Make a contribution at freebuddhistaudio.com/donate. And thank you.